John chapter 13 is where we are picking up our study together tonight. We hope that you're doing well on this Wednesday evening. John chapter 13, as we discussed last week, is this transition point. Jesus has exited, as far as John presents it, not in necessarily chronological order, if you were to take all the gospel accounts and put them together, but as John is presenting the gospel, that Jesus has exited the public ministry, so to speak. He's not going to be out and moving amongst other people, and we are fast forwarded to this private ministry, these literal last hours of Jesus with his disciples. And so we pick up here in chapter 13, which has sometimes been called the book of glory, as Jesus is going through to encourage the disciples, talking about his own glorification, and speaks often about the glory of God and his own glory. And so as we look at this chapter, it begins this section of this private ministry with the disciples as he is pointing them toward the future. And it goes on through chapter 17. And so chapters 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17, even though we'll take about a month to study them, looking at hopefully a chapter a week, they were actually given and lived out in just a matter of hours. And so we're really focusing in, we're at the Last Supper. We're looking probably a little before the institution of the Lord's Supper, according to some scholars. But they're here, and Jesus is preparing them for what is to come. And so this is very similar to many of the famous farewell addresses or discourses of leaders of old time. And so for an example, you've got the blessings that Jacob would pronounce upon his 12 sons in Genesis 49. Or you've got the farewell address of Moses in Deuteronomy 31 to 33, or the farewell address of Joshua in the last 2 or 3 chapters of the book of Joshua. And these farewell addresses had actually become quite common in Jewish writing, especially up to that point. And they had a number of different characteristics that followed this, not just inspired farewell addresses, but even other books, historical writings, things along that line that followed the same model of historical addresses. And they all kind of followed this model. First, there's a prediction of the death of the individual who is speaking. They understand that they're going to die. Sometimes that's because of old age. Obviously, in the case of Jesus, it's different because of his plan and the scheme of redemption. And then there's the prediction of future challenges that will arise. Once this person dies, there are challenges that will be faced. Then there are discussions about the arrangement of succession, who takes over. And of course, you can see that here in this discussion. Jesus will talk about the apostles and their work. He will talk about the Holy Spirit's coming to empower them to do that work. Then they also exhort behavior, moral and ethical behavior. This is how you should live after my departure. Then there is a final commission where he sends them forth, and there is an affirmation and a renewal of God's covenant and promises, reminding one another of everything that's been put in place. And then there's a closing doxology or praise. And if you were to take those criteria, 7 of them, and to take John 14, 15, and 16 and on into 17 with his prayer, you could see all of those things fitting perfectly together within that model. And so this is the first act of his private ministry, which will lead to the extended discussion with the disciples. And of course, we're first introduced to Jesus washing the feet of the disciples. And of course, this is one of the most well-known occasions of the ministry of Jesus. Now, what we have to keep in mind is that when you look at Luke's account of what's going on, and we are not necessarily looking as much at the other gospel accounts, just here and there, because we're trying to follow the flow of thought that John is presenting. But one of the things we know is that the disciples have been constantly arguing and disputing about who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. And many people believe that there is a direct connection between that and what Jesus does here in response to show them once again what greatness really is in the kingdom. So as we begin, chapter 13 and verse 1. Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And so we see the feast of the Passover, which we've talked about because it's been mentioned. It's one of those historical markers or time markers that we find throughout the book, the mention of the major feasts, and the Feast of Passover, of course, being one of the major markers. And this is, of course, the final Passover, and not just the final Passover in the ministry of Jesus, but really it would be the final Passover that would ever be observed according to God's authority and standard. Because from this point forward, Passover would lose its effect because Jesus would fulfill it. And then, as would take place at the Last Supper, things would be transferred into the Lord's Supper. So you have the Feast of the Passover, and Jesus knew that his hour had come. And we've already seen this a little bit in the latter part of the previous section of chapters 1 through 12. But for a great portion of the first part of the book, what is he constantly saying? My hour has not yet come. He departed from their midst because it was not yet his hour. His time had not yet come. But now the time has come. And so two of these main themes in John, the feasts and the hour, are now coming together because it is now time for them to meet. And so he's saying he's going to depart out of the world to the Father. And so he's going back to the Father, talking about his resurrection and ascension. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Now, the word translated end here is quite interesting. There are two ways to take it, and people are pretty equally split about how it should be understood and interpreted. Loving them to the end, some people see that as he loved them fully and completely while he was in the world. He loved them and gave them every measure of devotion. Other people see he loved them. The idea behind this word is telos, the reaching of a goal, that he loved them up to the brim. He loved them to the fullest possibility and perfection that only Jesus could love. And so here he is, he's loving his disciples. And so we see the bright light of Jesus returning, the anticipation of returning to glory and the love that fills his heart. But then we see the darkness that will fill the heart of Judas. It says, during supper, the devil had already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son. We've talked about Iscariot and it being the place of Kerioth in Judea, and how, of course, Judas was one of the only disciples not from Galilee, one of the only apostles. He was from the south. And so Satan had put into his heart Simon's son to betray him. And so here you have Jesus in all of his love, and then Judas in all of his darkness and betrayal. Verse 3, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hand, and that he had come from God and was going back to God. Now, what's interesting here is this. Jesus' act of humility comes, and John is writing, and he's trying to explain to us his greatest act of humility comes at a time when his exaltation is also at its greatest, when he's going to go to the cross and then be raised from the dead and then ascend back to the Father. And instead of basking in all of the glory that will be his and that is coming to him, he chooses to serve, and even more specifically, to serve an individual who's going to betray him, giving him opportunity after opportunity to change his mind if he so chooses. But he knows he's going back to God. This would be a time when people say, okay, it's time to serve me. It's my last time here. I'm going back to God. Everything's going to be great again. This should be about me. What the Bible says is he rose from supper, and he laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, he tied it around his waist, of course, to dry their feet after he washed them. And what's interesting is the word translated tie around here is also used in 1 Peter chapter 5 by the Apostle Peter to describe being clothed in humility. And many people have often wondered if there's not a connection when Peter is writing that phrase to his experience here at the Last Supper. But it says that he laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began washing the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with a towel that was wrapped around him. And so there would be a basin of water. He would put their feet over that and then pour water onto their feet and get the dirt and grime off. Of course, they're just wearing sandals. And so dust, if it hasn't been raining, dust is going to be covering their feet. If it's muddy, if it has been raining and it's muddy, of course, they're going to have mud on their feet, so they're going to need to get that off. It was a common custom, 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 10, about widows. Did they extend hospitality? Genesis 18 and verse 4, Genesis 19 and verse 2, the washing of feet was a very common thing for individuals, for them kind of to clean up and to get off the road. And so he's washing their feet, and he comes to Simon Peter and Simon Peter said to him, Lord, do you wash my feet? It's unheard of that the superior should wash the feet of the inferior. In Jewish literature and Greco-Roman literature, it's unheard of. And that's why Peter is kind of indignant, saying, what are you doing? Why are you washing my feet? This is something that's supposed to be reserved for, according to some Jews, in their thought, only a Gentile slave should be able to do this, not anybody else. So he's saying, you're washing my feet. And Jesus answered, what I'm doing, you do not understand now, but afterwards you will understand. You're going to understand what this is all about. And I believe in 1 Peter chapter 5, when he makes that reference about being clothed in humility, he has grasped fully what it is that Jesus was doing on this occasion. But this is known as an object lesson. Jesus is doing something, performing an act, and then he's going to expound upon that and help them to understand what that meant and all the implications. So in verse 8, Peter said to him, you will never wash my feet. Double negative. Some people believe, according to certain manuscripts, that Peter literally says, as long as the world stands, you won't wash my feet. Obviously, the hyperbole saying it's not going to happen. You're not washing my feet. So Jesus answered him and said, if I do not wash you, you have no share with me, no inheritance, no fellowship. It's imperative that I wash your feet. Simon said to him, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. The idea of a whole covering, the head, the hands, at the middle part of the body, the head at the top of the body, the feet at the bottom of the body, and all uncovered body parts, of course. The head would have been uncovered, the hands would be uncovered, and the feet would be uncovered. So he's saying, wash all of me. And Jesus said to him, the one who has bathed does not need to wash except for his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not every one of you. And so what he's saying is you've already had a bath, which would have been common before preparing for a feast. They would go through the ritual cleansing and bathing, and just their feet had gotten dirty. I mean, they were still clean, but just their feet needed to be clean. And what Jesus is showing him, it's even deeper than just the physical cleansing. It's a spiritual cleansing. You've already been cleansed. You've already been saved. But your feet need to be cleansed. And so even the Christian, once they come to Christ, they're still going to have their struggles with sin, and they're still going to need a continual cleansing. And then he says, and you are clean, but not every one of you. That is, Judas is not clean. Verse 11, for he knew who was to betray, or literally was betraying him, and that's why he said, not all of you are clean. Now, verse 12, when he had washed their feet and put on his outer garments and resumed his place, he said to them, do you understand what I have done to you? So here's the object lesson coming full circle. He says, you call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. That is absolutely correct for you to do. He says, if I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should do just as I have done to you. And so he's giving them this object lesson of humility and service. That if I, the Lord, and he said this on many occasions, the disciple is not above his Lord. If they persecuted me, they're going to persecute you. If I can, in humility, serve other people, then that's what you should be doing too. You should learn how to serve and love other people and one another. Quit the arguing about who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. I've already explained this. The greatest in the kingdom is about the individual who serves. It's not about position. And so that's what he's telling them here. And he says in verse 16, truly, truly, I say to you, that common refrain throughout the book, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Okay? Common illustration. The servant in the house is not greater than the master who owns and rules everything in the house. And the messenger, the one who is simply being a message boy, isn't greater than the one who sent the message. They don't have the right to open it. They don't have the right to make decisions on it. They're just carrying it from A to B. He says in verse 17, if you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. That is, you know them now. And the blessings of God are upon the man and the woman who choose in humility to serve one another and to serve other people. That's what I want you to do. That's what I want you to be about. Now, what's interesting here is that this occasion of service and humility is by all implications, he also washes the feet of Judas. And that's going to come full circle in these next few verses to see the grace of Jesus in his handling of Judas. Now, Jesus is not in any way caught off guard by what Judas is going to do. He knows exactly what's going on. And John actually wants us to understand. That's why he preserves this here in chapter 13. He wants us to know that Jesus is not caught off guard by what Judas is going to do. It's actually keeping in line and in keeping with what the scriptures have said all along. So he says this, I'm not speaking of all of you. I know whom I have chosen, but the scripture will be fulfilled. He who ate my bread has lifted up his heel against me. Psalm 41 and verse 9. I'm telling you this now before it takes place, and when it is done, and when it does take place, you may believe that I am, or I am he. That is, you may believe that I am God. That connection to Exodus 3 in verse 14. And so he's saying, I'm telling you this so you can know I wasn't caught off guard by this betrayal that's coming down the road. You don't understand it now, but you're going to. And I want you to hearken back and remember this. Now, this statement, Psalm 41 in verse 9, many people believe, and I think there's ample evidence for it. Matter of fact, the evidence is almost universally accepted. Psalm 41 was written by David in the time of Absalom's rebellion. And in Absalom's rebellion, he had one advisor who really turned against him named Ahithophel. And Ahithophel's advice and wisdom was not exceeded by anyone. He loved it. He went with Absalom. Now, the backdrop to that may be that Ahithophel, the granddaughter of Ahithophel, was Bathsheba. And so maybe he has some hard feelings about David toward everything that went down with Bathsheba's husband, and David, of course, stealing her from her husband. And so that may be some of the backdrop to that. But so David is lamenting in this psalm about being betrayed by a close friend. To share the table is the closest of fellowship, especially in a Middle Eastern culture. And so he's the one who ate the bread, who's eaten my bread. I've had him in my home. We have spent time together. He's lifted up his heel against me. And if you've ever had close individuals in your life with whom you have shared a life and then to watch them turn against you, it's a very hurtful thing. It's something that is a deep, deep wound. And that's why some people also connect this to Psalm 55, which people believe was also written during Absalom's rebellion, and think that some of the language is similar, may have reference also to Ahithophel there, that we used to go to the temple of God together. We used to go worship together, and now he's just turned his back on me. I don't understand what's happening. And so in this reference to this text, Judas's betrayal was foreshadowed in Scripture all along, and it fits right with one of the closest advisors of David betrayed him and later went and hung himself. And one of the closest disciples of Jesus, Judas, later betrayed him and will also end up hanging himself. And what's interesting is we sometimes miss this because the term or the name Judas is associated with betrayal. That's the way we've always known it from the time that we were kids, even the time we were first able to understand anything about Judas. We understood that Judas was synonymous with betrayal. And so it's hard for us to see sometimes this story unfolding the way that they saw it. And we'll see why that's important as we continue on. Now in verse 20, truly, truly, I say to you, whoever receives the one I send receives me, and whoever receives me receives the one who sent me. And so what he's talking about in this context is very similar to Matthew chapter 10 and verse 40, as Jesus sending out the disciples on the limited commission. That if you receive the apostles, you receive Jesus, and in receiving Jesus, you receive the Father. So there's this chain of command and succession, and that you can't separate those groups. Okay, you can't separate the Father from the Son. You can't separate the apostles from Jesus, especially as they are operating and speaking under inspiration. They're all directly connected to each other. And so that's what he's saying, to receive the one who sent me. Now in verse 21, he opens up his heart and says, after saying these things, Jesus was troubled in his spirit, severe mental turmoil. The cross, the weight of everything that's going to take place is upon him. Not just the physical suffering, the mental, the emotional, the spiritual, most importantly, suffering that he will endure on the cross. And he testified and said, truly, truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me. So now he opens it up for all the disciples sitting together around this U-shaped table. And so the tables would have a U shape. So if you are sitting and watching this video, there's a table that runs this way, there's a table that runs this way, and a table that runs this way. And where you're sitting in this scenario is an open portion of the table where the servant could come in and set the food before the individuals and then remove their plates. And they would recline around that table. forget the painting of Jesus, the most famous painting of Jesus' Last Supper. It's nothing like what the Last Supper was. I'm not saying that painting is illegitimate or that it doesn't have any value. I'm just saying it's not a historically accurate representation of what the Last Supper would have looked like. Okay, you'd have a U-shaped table, them reclining, not sitting in chairs, but actually reclining, leaning on usually the left hand with their feet out away from the table, and that would have made it easier for Jesus to wash the disciples' feet, and they would be lined up basically 3 across this way. And then you would be able to get more as you line down the sides, and they would also be reclining on their left, feet kicked out or away from the table. And so, verse 22, the disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he spoke. One of his disciples whom Jesus loved, this is the first reference to John. Of course, this is a reference to John. We went through all this in the introduction, so you can go back and see that if you want to hear more details. And of course, this phrase is going to be used over and over throughout the rest of this book, chapter 19, 26 and 27, chapter 20, verses 2 through 9 at the resurrection. Chapter 19 is at the cross before Jesus gives up the ghost. Chapter 20, the resurrection. Chapter 21, the post-resurrection appearance in verse 1 and verses 20 to 25. The phrase is used there as well. So the disciple whom Jesus loved, which we understand to be John, is reclining at the table at Jesus' side, most likely on his right side. So here's Jesus reclining on his left, and then looking at the back of John, who's also reclining on his left with his feet out away from the table. So Simon Peter motioned to him to ask Jesus of whom he was speaking. It's actually kind of funny if you think about it. A very intense moment, but also comical in some way, because Peter's like, hey, ask him. Who's he talking about? As if Jesus doesn't perceive it. So that disciple, verse 25, leaning back against Jesus, if he's lying on his left and Jesus is behind him, he would have leaned back this way and literally put his head on his shoulder and said, hey, who are you talking about? Lord, who is it? Jesus answered, it is he to whom I will give this morsel of bread when I have dipped it. Now, this morsel of bread was one of the best parts. It would have been dipped in bitter herbs and vinegar and water and salt and dried figs and raisins all mixed together in a concoction. And it was reserved for an individual of honor. And so Jesus, and it also appears that Judas is probably somewhere near Jesus. So if John is at his right, it may be that Judas is even at the direct left of Jesus, sitting in a place of honor. Now think about that with this whole motif, the one who is eating bread, lifting up his heel against him. And so here is Judas close to the Lord, sharing this meal with him, and the Lord does him a great honor. He's already washed his feet, and then he turns and first he sets him on his left side at the head of the table, and then he washes his feet, and now he turns and gives him the morsel of bread. It says, so when he had dipped the morsel, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. So he gives it to Judas, another great sign. And what Jesus is constantly doing is showing great love toward Judas, even though Judas has already purposed in his heart to betray him, and hatred has consumed him. And so you see in this juxtaposition or this contrast, the deep and abiding love of Jesus constantly reaching out to the one who hates him and the one who is going to betray him in just moments. So here is Jesus extending his hand to his betrayer. Now, what's interesting is that when you look at the other gospel accounts, you see them all asking questions. Lord, is it I? Lord, is it I? Lord, is it I who's going to betray you? And even Judas asks the question. His deception is unthinkable. The way he keeps up the facade, as if somehow Jesus doesn't know, but he's keeping up the facade so the other disciples don't know. But then pay attention to this timestamp, verse 27. Then after he had taken the morsel, Satan entered into him. It was now time to follow through on the plan. Jesus said to him, what you are going to do, do quickly. So Jesus looks at him and says, just go. Go do what you're going to do. He's extended every grace to him, every kindness to him. And after taking this great act of love of Jesus these great acts of love of Jesus, of putting him in a position of honor and then washing his feet and then taking the morsel, he still wants to. And that's the interesting thing, is when people are bent on their hatred and animosity toward an individual, no act of love can keep them from doing the terrible deed of betrayal. Verse 28, now no one at the table knew why he said this to him. So they thought that because Judas had the money bag, which we learned about in the previous chapter, Jesus was telling him, buy what we need for the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which was directly connected to Passover. Or that he should give something to the poor, which was common on the night of Passover, that at midnight they would open up those gates and people would come and give alms to the poor, and all the poor would gather around. And so maybe he's supposed to go do that and give something to the poor. So after receiving the morsel of bread, he immediately went out. So Judas exits the scene, off to betray him, off to the high priest. He's now found according to the synoptics, he's now found his occasion to betray Jesus. Then there's this interesting phrase at the end of verse 30, and it was night. Now it could be that John was simply observing of this statement, it was nighttime. But that's almost implied with the timetables, and so it seems as if there's something more here. So when he says it was night, a number of individuals, and I would put myself with them, think that this is a reference not just to the fact that it was night on the outside, that the sun had gone down, so to speak, and that it's now dark outside, but this represented the darkest moment in Judas's life and soul. I mean, Judas has gone into darkness. He has abandoned the light of Jesus and has gone fully into the darkness of the night to go into the darkest of deeds, to betray Jesus to the religious leaders. It was night. Then you see the statement, or the conversation shifts in verse 31. When he had gone out, notice that marker. Now that Judas has exited, Jesus said, now is the Son of Man glorified. And he begins this long discourse. Now is the Son of Man glorified, talking about what will happen to him on the cross. And God is glorified in him. And this phrase, Son of Man being glorified, is most likely an appeal or a reference back to Isaiah, what we know as Isaiah 49 in verse 3, one of the servant songs. And he says, if God is glorified in him, God will glorify him in himself and glorify him at once, talking about the exaltation. So there are three stages here, that Christ is going to be glorified immediately on the cross, and that God will be glorified through what Jesus does on the cross, and then God will glorify Jesus in the sense of resurrection and ascension, receiving him back into heaven. So there's this full circle of this scheme that is taking place. And now Jesus uses a term of affection in verse 33, little children, which, by the way, will become one of John's favorite phrases when you study the book of 1 John. Little children, yet a little while and I'm with you. You will seek me, and just as I said to the Jews, so now I say to you, where I'm going, you cannot come. This has reference to his death and his ascension back into heaven. Now, he had said to the Jews previously in chapter 7, 33 and 34, and chapter 8 and verse 21, that I'm going away and you won't be able to find me. You won't be able to follow me where I'm going. And ultimately they wouldn't, because of their rejection of him. They would never be able to go to heaven. And what he's saying here, what he says to the disciples here, you cannot come. What he means is you cannot come right now. We'll see in chapter 14, verses 1 through 3, they will one day go into heaven and be with him again, but not right now. And so he says, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Now, the command to love is not new in the sense that it's never been done before. It's never been given before. Leviticus 19 and verse 18 is one of the greatest commands in the law. The idea is the intensity, the depth, and the quality of this law. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. And this is the new part. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. Jesus has set the standard for loving others. And it's his unconditional love. Think about what he's just done to Judas, the individual who was going to betray him, putting him in the seat of honor, washing his feet, giving him the honor of the morsel, continuously loving, to love as Jesus loved, to love in an unconditional sense. That's what he's calling upon us to do, to love one another. And he says, when you do this, by literally walking this road of love for one another, all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. Some people have rightly called this the badge of discipleship, the honorary patch that an individual wears. This is how you know this is a disciple of Jesus, that these are a group of people who love one another. As the early church writers would later record about what the pagans said concerning Christians and their persecution, behold how they loved one another and that they're willing to die for one another. There is this sense of love, and I find it interesting that Jesus, as he begins this farewell discourse and says, you can't follow me, but I want you to love one another as I've loved you. And if you will love each other as I have loved you, everybody will know that you're mine. And as one writer put it, that command is so simple that a child can understand it, but it is so profound and so hard that the most experienced child of God reads it with embarrassment because they know they have failed time and time again to do what the command says. That we don't love the way Jesus loved on many occasions. Then Peter said to him, Lord, where are you going? Jesus answered, where I'm going, you cannot follow me now, but you will follow me afterward. I mean, even later in this book, when we get to chapter 21, verses 18 and 19, he's going to show Peter what kind of death he's going to die. Eventually, he's going to follow him. And Peter said to him, Lord, why can't I follow you now? He said, I will lay down my life for you. I'm willing to die for you right now. Why can't I follow you now? Now, sometimes when we look at this, and maybe it's justified, I don't know, but I feel like Peter gets a terrible rap about what's going on here. Number one, when you see Peter saying this, he's just in love with Jesus. Why can't I go with you now? It's not enough. He just wants to be with Jesus. It's not enough that he's going to get to be with him later. He just wants to be with him now. Why can't I follow you now? And he's willing to lay down his life for him. Some people say, well, he didn't mean that. In the heat of the moment, he thought he would. And then when time came, he forsook him and fled. And I get it. And I will entertain the thought that I have misunderstood this completely. But there's something that's always bugged me about that interpretation. Oh, Peter was just running his mouth here. And then when time came, he was a scaredy cat and he tucked his tail and he ran. But there's something that takes place in between these two events that so many people forget. Peter was willing to go to war. In chapter 18 and verse 10, he reaches forth with a sword and cuts off the ear of Malchus. Now, Peter has to know they're wildly outnumbered. They have no chance of winning. Surely, Peter knows he can't win. Surely he knows he's going to die. I struggle with the interpretation that says, no, he wasn't willing to die. Because I think he was. Now, Jesus' response, he answered and said, will you lay down your life for me? Now, he was willing to, I believe, lay it down the first time. I believe Jesus' answer really confounded and confused him. But there's no doubt that he denied him. He had a second opportunity to lay down his life with Jesus, to acknowledge him, and there's no doubt he blew that. No question. We've never questioned that. Which is seen in what Jesus said, truly, truly, I say to you, the rooster will not crow till you've denied me 3 times. And that rooster The roosters in Jerusalem would crow at 12:30, 1:30, and 2:30 a.m. in the morning. So he's saying, before that happens, you're going to deny me. And Peter does. And we'll see that. But you just can't help but, I don't know. Peter loved him. He loved him. And he blew it, but he loved him. And you know, for all the mistakes that he's going to make, and they're not excusable, I just sit back and I look at his heart, and I love it. He just loves Jesus. He just wants to be where Jesus is. I guess I just kind of wonder if that's how we are. We just want to be where Jesus is. Well, we're going to be separated. You're going to get to come late. Well, why can't I come now? And I guess maybe as a dad now, it hits me a little bit different. When I leave for work and I tell my boys I'll be back later, and then we're going to go somewhere. You can come with me then. And they look at me and say, "But Dad, why can't we go with you now?" They just love their dad, and I love them. So when we look at Jesus and the incredible love and humility and service that he renders, even though his disciples are far from perfect, they're getting certain portions. You can see so much of what Jesus has taught and shown them is rubbing off on them. And they're getting there. I guess the question for us is, where are we in this process? Are we imitating? Is Jesus rubbing off on us, so to speak, and transforming us into his image? You know, that question has a lot of eternal implications.